Welcome to the last episode of Cool British Singles from 1968. For the past 12 months, we've revisited some cool British releases from this pivotal year in the history of popular music. And now it's time to take a look at some good releases from December of that year. So without further ado, let's begin. December 1968 saw the release of Pink Floyd's fifth single and their last single in the UK for nearly a decade. The A-side was a Gilmour and Waters composition called Point Me at the Sky. The melody maker wrote,
"Point this at the chart and let it fly. Cynics who maintain that the Floyd are a spent force should prepare to masticate their syllables. They have successfully isolated a strain of pop production that is both infectious and imaginative. The riffs are old, but the sounds and thoughts are new. After several plays, the lyrics are still a little obscure, working on the assumption they mean more than the introduction, which simply talks about building a flying machine and taking off. Hidden depth, that's what I suspect is behind this Floydian hit."
The B-side was this spooky instrumental number. This track ended up becoming far more popular as it was included on a couple of albums and played regularly at concerts through the early 1970s. The single failed to chart in Britain. Following its lack of chart success, the band decided to stop releasing singles in the UK altogether and concentrate only on LPs.
Whether she'll come, I could not say.
Another highlight from December 1968 was this B-side by a group called Spice. The band featured future Uriah Heep members David Byron on vocals, Mick Box on guitar, and Paul Newton on bass. This B-side was the highlight of the single. The A-side was a rather weak pop number called What About the Music?
What about the music, baby? What about the moon? It's a shame if we don't use.
The single went pretty much unnoticed, but the group achieved quite a bit of notoriety in clubs all over Britain, and their success as a club band granted them the opportunity to enjoy a residency at the Marquee Club in London in early 1969. Later that year, organist Ken Hensley, formerly of the Gods, joined the band, and the group changed its name to Uriah Heep in February 1970 after supporting Deep Purple at St Mary's College in Twickenham.
In a white room with black curtains near the station.
December 1968 also saw the release of the last single by Cream. The single was released a couple of weeks after the group performed their farewell concert at the Royal Albert Hall. But both sides of the single had already been featured on the Wheels of Fire album, which was released in the UK in August 1968. The B-side was a song called Those Were the Days.
Those were the days. Yes, they were. Those were the days.
The melody maker wrote,
A fine heavy track with Jack Bruce singing lead and some wah-wah guitar by Eric Clapton, backed by Ginger Baker, bashing his drums into the ground. As an album track, it doesn't sound like a hit because most Cream fans will own it already.
The single peaked at number 28 and spent 6 weeks in the top 40. In the States, where the single had already been released in September, White Room reached number 6 according to Billboard.
Sounds in place will blow your mind. Your head hangs down 'cause he's your kind.
This group called Apple debuted in October 1968 with an excellent single whose B-side has become a cult favorite among many enthusiasts of late 60s psychedelia. This single from December was their second single, and it saw the band moving away from the psychedelic pop of their previous single towards a mix of hard rock and pop, which seemed to predate the glam rock sound that would take the British charts by storm later in the early to mid-70s. The melody from the chorus, however, seemed to be lifted from Ride My Seesaw by the Moody Blues. The B-side was a track called The Other Side.
her vision's far from me.
This B-side was an excellent moody psychedelic pop number, which had more in common with the group's previous single. Record Mirror wrote,
I thought the group's first release was going to make it, but it didn't. I think this one will succeed. Basically, it's a routine belter with jerky backbeat and a lot of fire in the staccato arranged vocal line. But the overall atmosphere lifts it, and it's good for dancing, and in all basic ways, very good.
Despite the quality of the single and the good reviews, the record failed to chart.
Kentucky woman, she shines in her own kind of light.
Deep Purple released their second single in December 1968. Their previous single was a massive hit in the States, reaching number 4 and remaining in the charts for several weeks. But inexplicably, the single was a flop in their native Britain, and it didn't even manage to reach the top 40. The group's second single was a cover of this track called Kentucky Woman, which was originally written and recorded by Neil Diamond in 1967.
Kentucky woman, she gets to know you. She gets to know you.
The B-side was a group composition called Ring That Neck. This instrumental number became a highlight of their concerts, and Deep Purple still performed the song live during the early days of the second lineup of the group with Ian Gillan and Roger Glover. Just like their previous single, Kentucky Woman was a flop in Britain, and most of the major music publications in the UK didn't even bother reviewing it. In the States, the single failed to reach the huge success of Hush, but the record still managed to reach a very decent number 22 according to Billboard. Another good single from December was this 45 by The Barrier. Just like many singles from that period, the highlight here was the B-side. This track featured a sort of proto-heavy metal riff and a melody that sounded like a cross between The Who and The Move. The A-side was not as good as the flip, but it was a decent track that probably could have made the charts if the single would have been properly promoted.
You know it's you should feel it too. Just like ABC, just like 1, 2, 3.
The group's live shows, which involved fire breathing, were pretty wild, and the band enjoyed more success in Europe than in their native Britain, where none of their singles managed to chart. Record Mirror wrote,
Group from Fulham and a commercial Howard Blakely song. Generally speaking, this is good pop, although it could easily miss out. It's lively though.
Just like their previous releases, the single was a commercial failure, and the group broke up shortly after.
So follow me, it's good for you. That good old-fashioned medicated good.
December 1968 also saw the release of this single by Traffic. The single was released just a few days before the press announced that the group was breaking up. Of course, the group's breakup was due to the fact that Stevie Winwood and Eric Clapton were starting to form Blind Faith. Both sides of the single were featured on the album Last Exit later in May 1969. The B-side was a song called Shanghai Noodle Factory.
In a Shanghai noodle factory, place where I once used to be. Nowhere doing.
The Melody Maker wrote,
Steve Winwood looks like getting a much-needed hit with a strangely danceable soul sound, continuing Traffic's trend to heaviness. Apparently, Steve does all the guitar, piano, and organ bits, as well as the earthy vocal. There was a period when it seemed that Steve's voice was deteriorating, around the time of Traffic emerging from the ashes of the original Spencer Davis group. But now, he's singing better than ever, and this should rock a way chart high. P.S. When I find out what medicated goo is, I'll let you know.
Despite the good reviews, the single failed to chart in both the UK and in the US.
See the crazy man alone, waiting in the fields alone for the rain.
This 45 by a group called Rhubarb is by far the weirdest psychedelic single released in December 1968.
I can take the grains of sand and turn them into fertile land.
The single went completely unnoticed when it was originally released, but both sides of the record were rediscovered years later when they surfaced on compilations of forgotten psychedelic singles from the 60s. The A-side was a track called Rainmaker. The B-side was a track called Moneylender. This was yet another psychedelic number that, just like the A-side, sounded more like a track from 1967 rather than a recording from late 1968. The band was formed in Berkshire in 1967, but not much is known about the group. Peter Smith and Phil Chilton, who wrote both tracks, ended up writing the score for an Italian film in 1970. And apparently, Peter Smith had a long career as a composer and producer of library music. Unfortunately, this excellent psychedelic single was largely ignored by both the press and the radio, and it inevitably flopped. Stevie Winwood left the Spencer Davis Group in 1967, and the group never managed to replicate the success they had with Winwood in the band. Despite their lack of success, however, some of their post-Winwood singles were actually quite good, and deserved better luck. This single from December 1968 was not as good as some of their previous releases, but it was still a good track that is definitely worth a spin. Record Mirror wrote,
"This really is good stuff, and I just wonder if it could bring a change of luck for the likable Spence. It's less involved than he has been recently, and there is a choral effect chanting the title and good lead voice and some explosive moments in the backing. I do hope it makes it."
The single didn't make the charts, and Spencer Davis and Company ended up disbanding in late 1969 after an American tour.
Sit outside in the cold where the wind blows old.
Another highlight of December 1968 was this B-side by a group called the Mirage. The Mirage achieved a bit of notoriety in 1966 when they covered Tomorrow Never Knows by the Beatles. At the time, many groups and artists were covering songs from Revolver and releasing them as singles. But the Mirage were the only band who dared to cover Tomorrow Never Knows, by far the most experimental track on the album.
Love is all and love is everyone. It is now
But despite the notoriety, chart success always seemed to elude them, and this single from December 1968 was no exception. This was the last of 7 singles that they released between 1965 and 1968. The A-side was a rather substandard pop number that they were forced to record by their record label. The highlight here was the B-side. The single didn't chart, and the group changed its name to the Portobello Explosion in 1969. December 1968 also saw the release of this sort of rereading of A Whiter Shade of Pale, with over-the-top reverberating wall of sound production. This was Grapefruit's 4th single. Grapefruit were the first band to get signed to the Beatles' Apple Publishing, but the group never achieved the success that everyone expected. And by the time this single was released in December 1968, RCA had already dropped the band in the UK, and the new head of Apple Publishing released the group from its Apple contracts. Record Mirror wrote,
Very high-pitched lead voice here, with organ prominent in the background. Really a high-class performance and production. So it may not have that instant commercial quality, but the atmosphere, sincerity and sensitivity is there in abundance. Sounds like a massive orchestra and chorus in there as well. The single was recorded partly in America, and it's tremendous.
The similarities with A Whiter Shade of Pale prompted many people to dismiss the single as derivative and unoriginal. Although the Procol Harum classic was itself heavily inspired by Bach, and even the Beatles used the same chord progression for All You Need Is Love. Personally, I think this is a Baroque pop masterpiece, 60s pop at its best. but unfortunately the single failed to make the charts. I hope you enjoyed this trip back to December 1968, and I hope you enjoyed these series about cool British singles released that year. See you next time.